Hello, I'm Danny. I was an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for 60 years. Now, the Mormon Church has 4 books it considers Scripture: the Bible, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. And within the Pearl of Great Price, there is a book called the Book of Abraham, and that is the topic for this video today. I want to ask those who are Latter-day Saints if you've ever prayed to know if the Book of Abraham is true. Unlike the Book of Mormon, there's no invite in the Book of Abraham to ask God if it is true. Perhaps that's why no one I know has ever tested the Book of Abraham in that way. They assume it is true because Joseph Smith claimed to have the gift to be the translator of ancient records. Their trust is in Joseph Smith being a true prophet who would never lie about such a thing. Or would he? What if you became aware that the Book of Abraham has been proven to be something other than a direct translation from ancient papyri, from ancient Egyptian into 16th century King James English, no less? Are you aware that when Joseph Smith claimed it to be a direct translation of ancient scrolls, that it has since been proven to be a fraud? Let me begin by sharing some LDS church history. In 1835, a traveling showman by the name of Michael Chandler brought an exhibit of Egyptian artifacts to the Mormon town of Kirkland, Ohio. Those artifacts consisted of 4 ancient Egyptian mummies and 2 papyrus scrolls. Because the Latter-day Saints believe their prophet Joseph Smith had the gift to translate the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon gold plates that were inscribed in Reformed Egyptian, those same Latter-day Saints believe that Joseph might want to see if the papyri were of any religious value to them. Smith examined the hieroglyphics on the scrolls and declared to them to be the writings of Abraham and the writings of Joseph, who was sold into Egypt. Despite the severe financial problems the church was suffering at the time, it purchased the scrolls for $2,400, which was a lot of money in those days. And Joseph immediately began the translation of the first scroll. He stated in Joseph Smith History of the Church, Volume 2, pages 235 through 236, quote, "I commenced the translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy, found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham," end quote. So the question is, was he telling the truth or not? Well, the work began in Kirkland and abruptly ended in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1842. Consequently, he never got around to the translation of the supposed writings of Joseph of Egypt. But in the eyes of the church members, this translation of Abraham's record validated that Joseph indeed was a prophet, seer, and revelator. Contained within the book were unique and distinct doctrines such as the pre-existence of spirits, eternal progression, and the plurality of gods. It also introduced the first and only scriptural basis for the denying of the priesthood to people of black skin. You can find that curse of Cain as it's referenced in Abraham chapter 1, verse 21 through 27. The value and impact of the Book of Abraham was recognized at once by the faithful, and Joseph continued to expound upon its contents in lectures and sermons right up to the time of his death in 1844. Now, let me tell you what became of the papyrus scrolls that the Book of Abraham was translated from. Once Joseph Smith was killed in 1844, the papyri collection remained in the possession of his widow Emma, who refused to follow the leadership of Brigham Young and remained in Nauvoo with her children while the Saints moved west to the Utah Territory. In October of 1880, the Book of Abraham was included in the Pearl of Great Price, which was officially canonized at the church's semi-annual General Conference in Salt Lake City. That's in 1880. Maintaining the divine authority of the Book of Abraham remains every bit as vital to the doctrines and theology of the LDS Church today as it did in the days of Joseph Smith. The introduction to the Book of Abraham read, quote, "The writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus." Now keep that in mind. Nearly 40 years passed from the time Joseph translated the Book of Abraham until it was officially recognized as sacred scripture of the LDS Church. That was in 1880. However, during that period, something occurred which neither Joseph nor any of his contemporaries could have foreseen. After many years of dedicated work on the Rosetta Stone, scholars in Europe were finally able to decipher the ancient Egyptian language. It was now possible to accurately translate Egyptian texts, yes, even without the mantle of a prophet. Initially, it did not appear likely that this new development would impact the isolated Utah Mormon Church, now headquartered in the Rocky Mountains. So, what happened to those papyrus scrolls that Emma had? Well, they were eventually sold by her and made their way to the Museum of Chicago. They were presumed to be destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. But Smith's papyri had not been destroyed after all. Lost yet, yes, but not forever. One day in 1966, now this is nearly 100 years later, a professor of Arabic studies from the University of Utah entered one of the vault rooms of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, seeking material for a book that he was writing. Dr. Aziz Ataya came across a file that contained an apparently forgotten collection of Egyptian papyri, which had been glued to stiff backing paper in the 19th century in an effort to preserve them. The reverse sides of the paper contained such things as archaeological drawings of the temple and maps of Kirkland, Ohio. Dr. Ataya, not a Mormon himself, recognized the collection as having a connection with the history of the LDS Church. Dr. Ataya arranged for the LDS Church to acquire this collection from the New York Museum. On November 27, 1967, the Salt Lake Desert newspaper announced the discovery of the original papyri which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham. There was great excitement. I can remember at that time being alive and hearing this news. There was great excitement and anticipation among the Latter-day Saints. Questions quickly arose. Would the arguments of critics be overcome and silenced at last? Would Joseph Smith's work finally be justified before the eyes of a skeptical world? The saints waited expectantly and held their breath. And we can only imagine the anticipation, since the LDS Church had been criticized all those years for not having the gold plates to validate the Book of Mormon translation, and the ancient Egyptian papyri to validate the Book of Abraham. Finally, there was highly educated Egyptologists who could translate the writings on the papyri and let everyone know that it was truly what Joseph Smith claimed it to be, the Book of Abraham. Now that the papyrus scrolls were back in the custody of the Mormon Church, it allowed photographs of the papyri to be published in the February 1968 edition of the Improvement Era magazine, along with an article explaining them. Now that over 100 years had passed since the book's translation, there were many educated people, both in and out of the LDS Church, who understood the Egyptian language. Now, during this time, many articles ran in the Improvement Era from 1968 through 1970 regarding the translation. However, the LDS experts' completed work revealed that not only did the papyri not contain the writings of Abraham, there was not even the remotest connection between their contents and Abraham. They were simply ordinary Egyptian funeral texts, prayers to pagan Egyptian gods that had been buried with the mummies. Unsatisfied with the outcome, LDS leaders extended the opportunity to several non-LDS Egyptologists to examine and comment on the papyri. Each one of them arrived at the same conclusion. The papyri were common funerary texts, all clearly dating 1,500 years later than Abraham's time, having no connection whatsoever with the biblical patriarch Abraham. What Joseph Smith claimed to be the book of Abraham was in reality called the Book of Breathings. And what was supposed to be the book of Joseph of Egypt, that second scroll, was the Book of the Dead, written by a very superstitious people and quite different from the religion of Christianity and the theology that contradicted the Bible. If you are LDS and haven't fully considered this before, you might decide that, well, despite these problems with the book of Abraham, you still have a testimony that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. I don't question your testimony is sincere. I just wonder if it's based on subjective feelings of the heart instead of proven, reliable facts. God doesn't usually create faith by first offering evidence, but at some point, He does provide the evidence necessary to support true faith. To be objective, you must be willing to examine the evidence both for and against any religious claims. It is a painful fact of life that sincerity is not a guarantee against being wrong. Faith must have its basis in fact. For a testimony to be valid, there must be something to support it, to serve as a witness for it. Conversely, there must be nothing that legitimately discredits it. A willingness to accept facts as they exist and to learn to use them to test the views one holds rather than falling back on subjective experiences or rationalizations is the first step towards discovering genuine truth. Now, virtually every Mormon belief about the Book of Abraham, once considered essential to its support, has been shattered by the true facts. Not one trace of reliable evidence has ever appeared that would support the LDS view of the book as authentic scripture. While an enormous amount of evidence is available to show that it is a man-made production of the 19th century created by Joseph Smith to support his claims to be a prophet, seer, and revelator, he needed to continue to further that image so that, the people wouldn't leave him, so that his faith or his newfound religion would progress. If the book is man-made and not from God, what does that say about the doctrines it teaches or the religious system to which it belongs? That's a very important question to ask yourself. You need to know, since the original papyrus contains nothing about Abraham, some Mormon apologists have suggested that Joseph Smith may have obtained the content of the Book of Abraham by way of direct revelation rather than through literal translation. In other words, from inspiration, not translation of the papyri. These defenders of Mormonism suggest that perhaps he was inspired to write the Book of Abraham as he was looking at the unrelated hieroglyphics on the scrolls. Those who try to use this escape find themselves trapped by the words of Joseph Smith himself. You know why? Because Joseph Smith not only claimed he translated it from papyri, but affirmed that it was, and this is in his words, quote, a correct translation, end quote. That's from Joseph Smith's History of the Church, Volume 2, page 351. Because the LDS Church rarely announces changes that they make in their doctrines or policies, you might not have noticed that in 2013, changes were made to the Mormon scriptures. And at that time, the description of the Book of Abraham was changed. The introduction used to say the Book of Abraham was a translation from some Egyptian papyri. Now it states, quote, and that it is an inspired translation of the writings of Abraham, end quote. This seems to be an effort by the LDS Church to distance itself from the text, in the text, from the actual writings on papyri. If Joseph Smith fails as a translator of the Book of Abraham, where his translation can be checked against the papyri, why would anyone believe this translation, or his translation of the Book of Mormon, when there's no evidence the gold plates ever existed? That was what first entered my mind when I found out the truth about the papyri. Honestly, my friends, that was a major factor in my deciding that Mormonism was not true. The founder of the LDS Church, who was a self-proclaimed prophet of God, was at least deceitful, if not an outright liar, about his gift to translate ancient scripture. That's the conclusion I came to. And the LDS Church has finally come forth to address this sticky issue. The church finally confronted the problem by releasing a gospel topic essay around 2013 titled Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham. That was the same time that the introduction to the book was changed. You can find that essay on the LDS Church website under Gospel Topic Essays. This essay justifies its existence by concluding that, quote, Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri as a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. They catalyzed a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith revelation about the life of Abraham, even if that revelation did not directly correlate to the characters on the papyri, end quote. This is commonly known among LDS apologists as the catalyst theory, or the catalyst method, where a person can look at an unrelated document and be inspired to write about something entirely different. And in this case, it's a desperate attempt to justify what they have in their scripture called the Book of Abraham. Now remember all those principles, all those doctrines that were taught in the Book of Abraham about pre-existence and priesthood and the plurality of gods and all that. If the Book of Abraham isn't true, are those principles and those teachings true? I don't think so. Not in my life. I don't believe that anymore. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only time Smith's claim to translate got him into trouble. I will release in my next video the account of the Kinderhook plates. You may or may not have heard that, but it was an intentional trap to catch Joseph in a lie about his gift as a translator. And guess what? It worked. Well, stay tuned. Thank you for watching this video. You can find more on YouTube and at talkingtomormons.com. And until next time, God bless.